Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Zandri Faree, a senior legal advisor and account lead at Radiant Law. I am really pleased to be joined today by Jodi, who has been leading the AI adoption within HSBC's legal function. Jodi brings a huge amount of hands-on experience in what actually works, and I think just as importantly, what doesn't, when it comes to introducing AI into legal teams. So in today's session, we'll be focusing on the practical side of AI adoption rather than just talking about tools in isolation. But just before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. So feel free to post your questions in the Q&A chat throughout the session. We'll aim to leave some time at the end for a live Q&A and pick up as many of these as we can. And then we will also be sharing the recording of the session, which excludes the Q&A part, via email after this. So with that, Jodi, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and share a bit more on your background and your work in this space.
Fantastic. Yeah, great to be here today. So I'm in the legal operations team in-house at HSBC, and we are quite a large regulated bank with a number of legal professionals right around the globe. So everything from Australia to Brazil and everything in between, right around the globe. So my focus is on legal. I do work with colleagues in other teams and across the bank, and we interact with our lessons learned. But my focus is around, supporting our legal team being ready for AI tools, for experimenting, building confidence, and I focused on that. It's been about 2 years. So it was a bit of a transition, and my background has been around process improvement, business change, transformation programs. I've worked in a number of different industries. So local government, I've worked for software companies earlier in my career. And then just before HSBC, I did spend 5 years as the IT legal business partner within Unilever. So it's probably a good solid 10 years dedicated in this space.
Thanks, Jodi. I think this is really helpful context, and it's great to hear a bit more about your journey. And I think that's why today will be useful. I think right now, a lot of organizations are beyond the AI curiosity stage and are now asking, how do we actually make adoption real and sustainable? So I think let's start at the beginning before we roll out any tools. So in your view, what does readiness before tech really look like in practice for a legal team?
Yeah, and there's a number of things, but I think if we think of people, process, and technology, that triangle has been around a very, very long time. It hasn't actually changed. And obviously, the thing about generative AI is, for legal, it's probably the first tech in a really long time that's actually really opened up, the opportunity, because so much in law is language, and the large language models really have been the unlock. But some of the areas that we focused on was actually building people's confidence in exploring and experimenting, and we encourage people to use things in their personal life. And we did run sessions. I got tasked probably it'd be December 2024, build a groundswell within legal with AI. And I did think, right, well, we don't have tools that we can use internally, but we did come up with, approaches and ideas. And some of that was, finding different people in legal who like different types of tools. So my favorite has always been, I'm going to declare this from the first time we met, is Claude. I have played with lots of the different tools, but definitely Claude's mine. Someone on my team's Gemini has always been her. She's tried, again, lots of tools, but that's her go-to. Someone else's ChatGPT. We had colleagues, in Asia and China who explored DeepSeek. So we did run sessions, and we were coming up with use cases, not just like find me a recipe and things like that, but genuine use cases in the home life. And we were able to share that from the mobile phone. And again, that was all around your personal use. So that was the sort of a first step. And then the next was around experimentation. And I won't go too much into detail, but we did find a way, and we did have a sandbox and an internal tool to be able to do some experimentation. So all the way through to 2025, we then were building the skills and the capability, But the really important thing is it's the sharing of that experience. And we had people share when they tried things that didn't work as much as tried things that did work. So we got that balance right.
Yeah, and I think it's you learn just as much through the things that didn't work as through the things that did work. I think actually you learn more when you look at where things went wrong and to help build, because it might just be one instance that something went right, but the learning comes from those errors and things that went wrong. So you touched on the confidence of users, and I think one thing that we find is there is fears and resistance points when introducing AI within a team. So what are those most common fears that you see that come up within teams and hesitance to look into adoption of AI?
Yeah, in some cases, when we think about legal professionals and people who have trained lawyers, those people have been trained to get things right, to get things as good as they can. And all of a sudden we're saying, have a go with the technology that is still new. It's only been around for a few years. It's still new, it's still different. Um, Lead by example has been making people, people who are visible, and it doesn't matter whether they're senior or junior, that's irrelevant. But we did make sure that we had examples that people could identify with right through the organization. And my chief legal officer, Bob Hoy, is a great, example of somebody who he wasn't just driving the generative AI because it was the thing that he needed to do. He did it, particularly with legal. And as you say, that resistance and that fear, he gave people the space, he gave people permission, he gave his direct reports that time, and he expected them to give, all the way down. And the communications messages coming from all different angles was create that space because, in the future, and ultimately we wanted a function who were comfortable using it, and that's why we started with the foundations and the basics. So again, and those sharing of stories came from all levels of the organization, all different jurisdictions, all different business lines. So it was really about and our comms team and our engagement team did a great job with sharing those messages.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that really resonates from our side at Radiant as well. Like you treat readiness as change management. You make it feel practical and safe and not just theoretical, and sharing those use cases and experiences from all within the team. And you kind of build momentum with that. And just by trying something small, low risk use cases and share what worked, kind of builds that excitement, but also that openness to try something new.
Yeah.
So just in respect of, we have a lot of different participants on the call and attendees today from different areas and that have possibly started with this process, but do you have any signs that would indicate within your team that you saw that the team is generally becoming AI ready, that there is that change, that kind of more forward-looking mindset within the team?
100%. And we've seen that through a few different things. A lot of that is the different activities we've done. So, we're always tracking the attendance and the feedback, and we're regularly, it's not complicated surveys, but we really do get that feedback from people when they've joined sessions, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and then having that constant, loop of improvement. But it is about, setting that scene and and doing something with that feedback. Because I think if we just collected the feedback and then just went on and did whatever we were planning to do, that's sort of empty. And I would say people can see through that. They can smell it. They can feel it. They know when something's been done with it. But, we were sharing those metrics back, and we were sharing, you told us this, and then we took this action. And a great example, which I know we're going to get into this sprint, that experimentation model that we did, but we had a sandbox environment. We did come up with some use cases, and we offered for teams of people to run a 4-week sprint. They could create their own use case, but we did have 8 that we started with so that they could pick from. And they were everything from communications to, simplify, like your legal design, simplifying language. So it was everything in between, very much legal focus, but it was all, like internal. It was more of a pilot or a proof of concept. But what it did do was give them the space that when we finish that cycle, again, part of that 4 week sprint is a sprint review, and then reflecting on what went well, what didn't go well. And then the teams shared with each other. So we had 8 teams globally over that 4 week period. But one of the things that came out was prompt training. So this is going back to last April, May. And so one of the actions that was taken and that our leadership team endorsed was, some prompt coaching. And it was really good hands-on practical coaching. Whether you were a beginner or an expert, you got something from the training. And that was rolled out to everybody globally. It wasn't mandatory, but we were pushing 90% attendees from across legal, and that was globally. And the feedback we got was 95% of the people would recommend it to a colleague. So that we ran through the summer. So yeah.
So with this and the experimentation of your sprint model, I think what were the biggest lessons you learned from running these experiments and these sprint models that you can take back and share?
Yeah, so I think giving some use cases up front so people weren't starting from a blank sheet I'm glad that we did that. We were trying to find the right balance of not wanting to make it prescriptive, but not wanting people to feel intimidated about, volunteering and taking part. And we didn't have that issue, so that was great. And we had people who were really excited to get, their hands on to, as I say, we have an internal productivity tool now, and we had that from last summer that, went to production, but this was the pre-bit to that. Again, I think it was the lessons learned, having that time to reflect. So the way that the sprints were set up is week 1 was making sure that people had access to the tool. And where people didn't have access to the tool, we had sessions in where someone with it, because not all jurisdictions had access, would do a Zoom call, screen share, and the team would come together. So there were different where we didn't, just because you didn't have access didn't mean you couldn't be on a sprint team. But week 1 was about getting going, getting familiar with the tool, understanding the use case, making sure that if they wanted to tweak the use case or even start with a new one. So that was week 1. Week 2, and this is, again, things have moved on now, but it was personas and prompts. And then week 3 was refining those and testing edge cases. So we'd given them a framework to work through, and it was really, 1 to 3 hours a week. It wasn't a huge amount of time. And we did time box it in 4 weeks. And then week 4 was that lessons learned. When we first started, I'm not sure we expected that we would get together as a group and share everything, but that came out and people were really curious what others did. So we responded pretty quickly. And about week 6, we got everyone together, and then they were able to share the use cases and do demos about what they did. So yeah, it was a really good engagement. It became a little bit competitive too, in a nice way, but I found our legal teams very competitive.
Yeah, no, you would never say that lawyers could be considered competitive, but I think things like this bring out that sportsman within anyone. And I think I love the emphasis on breaking these into steps and building reviews of the workflows. I think we've also seen quality improve when you stop testing AI and treating AI as a one prompt and done type of review session, but instead designing the task properly and looking back and reviewing and adapting. So I think that's a good approach. I just wanted to, I know we positive in sharing the successes and how great things have worked, but also there comes mistakes with these things as well. So I don't know if you have some most common mistakes that you've seen the team make during the early experimentation phase that you've learned from.
Yeah, I think it's not having the time available, where if they struggled and other priorities came up or something happened. And we did have one team that actually couldn't finish what they were going to do. So it is about having the space and the time. We did have one of the most senior lawyers was in one of the sprint teams, which was amazing. And I think that, that really helped give people the confidence that they could make the time. So yeah, as I say, I think the biggest thing is actually, carving out the time, because it is important. And in one breath, it's difficult. But if it's someone's goal that you need to do something like this, and it's one of their objectives, that's a conversation with their manager about how do I reprioritize so that I can create this space to do this for 4 weeks? And there will be times that things come up and things arise and you can't do it. And we did have the sprint, program continue. So we didn't do another big, huge one, but we did have some teams that did a few more sprints. So that would probably be the biggest one. And the leadership, and it needs to not get lost at the middle management. That's not, again, that's a new thing in change management where the messages come down and sometimes it gets diluted or it's not quite clear. And therefore, that's where group communications, and not heavy messages, but in our newsletters and our town halls, in different mechanisms, we have messages. So people were, if they didn't necessarily hear it from their manager, they were hearing it through other channels. And that was really good as well.
Yeah, that constant feedback and reminder, and trying to look at how to kind of integrate it into day to day rather than a once-off use case, or looking at it just from the sprint. So I think this kind of leads into our next topic on how do you scale that capability without it becoming a hero driven, or that one person that's extremely excited about it. And it's dependent on those that enthusiasts to keep that going and keep the momentum going, and rather adopting it across a global team. So how do you take those successes and implement them across the global team?
Yeah, so I'd say the first place where we really, really scaled was our internal productivity tool within the firm. And it was, again, our chief legal officer made the statement of, lawyers work in language all the time. That's what this tool is about. They have a professional, responsibility and duty within their qualification and their practice license. So it didn't take long for, our leadership and our tech leadership to come back and say, well, would you be interested if legal would want to go first? And therefore we were the first one to go, which was great. We then had to move quite quickly to get some materials and training available for people. So we had some guides with some prompts to get people going, but that was to get started. I'd say the area where we were able to make a step change is, we call it catalysts, but like a champions network. And they are across the globe and in each business line. So each of our leadership team have nominated 2 people. And that means there's then a group of, I've got a group of 30 to 40 people that my manager, Jess, and myself, that we engage with, instead of 3 of us trying to speak to everyone. And our legal team is, we're over 1,200 people. So when there's only 3, we're not a massive team. We do obviously have change people that are there to support us and engagement. But when it comes to the AI stuff, it is us. So having those materials in place and having that network, and then we meet regularly. So, those are the people that get early access if we do have, training or technology, and we get feedback from them regularly. And it's a 2-way dialogue, and we have monthly meetings, and sometimes we have more. So that's been one of the things with scaling. So, and then the other thing about that, which, it did take some time, and we did have to do, a few iterations, but let's say between, last summer and the end of the year, we did, again, going back to that thing of, we may have had the right people, but they didn't have the time available. So we did revisit, did we have the right catalysts? Did they have the time? I mean, they were probably the right people, but did they have the capacity? And it's not a huge amount, but, did they have the time to do, at their team meeting, every team meeting, they have 5-10 minutes. And is their, legal leadership team member giving them that time to be able to do those presentations and things like we've created, I guess what you might call success boards. So it's not prescriptive. It's not overly, it's not structured, and the teams can create it how they want, but it's a place where they can put things that they've done and they've done in the tool that have worked. And then it's a really easy place for, if you can think of it, you could do it in Teams, you could do it in SharePoint, you could do it, and there's lots, but anywhere we have sort of that Post-it note sort of picture, and then people can go and see what others are doing. And again, that's really what's helped scale it.
Yeah, and I think that knowledge sharing is critical in these types of rollouts, especially because you are experimenting, you're finding something that works for you, and it might not be something that person sitting right next to you even considered, but just going through that knowledge base kind of helps trigger, oh, I could adapt this to my use case and not necessarily have to start from scratch, and makes that connection throughout the team. And I think that knowledge sharing we found is very critical to kind of making sure that people don't feel isolated or not or blocked in trying to solve a problem.
And you know what? It's the blocked, but it's also they don't feel left out or they're worried that they're behind. And a lot of times it's conversations and it's that, it's making sure that when you're delivering messages to people, it's not always the most complicated, example. Always remember to get a mix of, more complicated stuff, but the easier stuff, and maybe reshare stuff that was from before, because, again, depending on the organizations, you may have governance you need to go through to be able to allow a tool to go live. There's some that require, you might need approvals from some government organization. You may not. It could be your internal approvals. But because it gets rolled out at different stages, one thing that I've learned is making sure that you remember the people that are following on and didn't have a chance to go early on. Because again, the worry is someone comes along and it's not so much the fear of missing out, but it's like the fear of being left behind or being worried about asking what someone might say is, a silly question. And you just, and we do have lots of conversations and other programs around the bank. We have, how we lead, and simplification. So we've got lots of messages around, let's fix processes and then let's look at technology, but let's experiment and learn so that once we've sorted the processes, we'll bring those together and then we're ready to actually make the change.
So I just, in respect of, so you share all of this knowledge and you have track and the team share within that they are using it, then there are these use cases. But how do you measure whether adoption is actually working in process, whether it is actually improving systems, and kind of track that metric?
Yeah, so we have a combination of things. So, I mean, and this is right across, and this isn't specific to legal, this is right across AI. Currently, a lot of the metrics around, not just whether you've logged in, we do more than that, but a lot of the metrics are around volumes of interactions. And that's been a key metric for us tracking adoption. So what are the unique engagements with the different tools? So that is still quite a helpful metric. We are wanting to move, and we are making a move towards, how are we making sure that we're getting the best value? Because just because I use it loads, I might not be using it for the best things that can make things work better. But actually, that's not where we're at now. That will come with maturity. What I'd say around the metrics is when we were doing, even in our testing, so, proof of concept and evaluations, A/B testing. So how you do it either with a generic tool versus a legal specific tool, or a generative AI tool versus how do I do it today without it? So how do I do it manual or, analog or traditional tech? And I would say that the intel and insights that we got from that feedback, a lot of it was qualitative. We had a good amount that was quantitative, but it is about coming up with a framework. Not, we had a handful of use cases we did want to test, but we allowed the legal professionals to come up with their own use cases. But it was really important that they documented it. And then it was things like, whether it saved time, did it improve quality, are we going to be able to speed things up and reduce costs? So it was a mixture of all sorts of things. And, that was we had something called an activity card, and we captured that. And that really was such a powerful, metrics to be able to then move quite quickly. And I'd say, we definitely, within legal we're leading the way in how we were doing that tracking and metrics. And it's been able to help us work out, well, where should we focus, or where have we got gaps? Because sometimes maybe we didn't have enough information, and we can go back and do that again and revisit it once we go into pilot, which is exactly what we did. So that A/B testing, ABC testing you might do. So you might do legal specific tool, generic product, a generative tool, and manual. And don't try to do like thousands of use cases,
Yeah.
a handful, or focus your work, because you can get really distracted.
Yeah, and I think this touches on what we kind of touched on earlier around the kind of sharing that knowledge and sharing that insights to kind of keep the momentum going and showing those metrics and the quality improvements, or like the time saved on the tasks, or actually a concrete example of, okay, this is the difference that this tool makes, to kind of keep that momentum, instead of, oh, okay, we need to sign into an AI tool once a day and make it a tick box kind of more exercise than rather implementation. And I think that's important, is to keep that knowledge flowing and those metrics as well, to ensure that everyone kind of sees the benefit on a consistent basis. Because I think, especially in the legal industry, we have a tendency to stick to what we know, stick
Yeah.
to how it's been done, how our principal taught us, how his principal taught him. And it's that realizing that this change has a lot of benefits and scope to make things a lot easier, although it may require some time and energy to put it in place at this moment. And I think this kind of leads us to a bit of our final piece around leadership behavior and their role. You lightly touched on it earlier, but the fact that AI adoption doesn't happen in isolation. It's driven from the top. You kind of need your leaders to be on board. And just from your side, what role do leaders play in making the adoption successful?
Yeah, and this again, I touched on it. So within the bank, we have how we lead, and leaders are at all levels, and we do have leaders within AI, right from the most senior to the more junior colleagues, which is amazing. And it's about giving them that voice and that the visibility. So we found ways to share those stories, whether it be a blog, whether it be a little video vignette, whether it be a quote, and and capturing stuff from the survey. So at first off, would say that, but I will touch on from the senior leadership, that has been one of the best things from this program, which it has really made a difference. And I've had senior sponsorship before, but really in this one, they are putting themselves out there. They are sharing, across teams and with teams, whether we do, a series like this internally on different topics with different AI tools and different, even setting the scene. So we have a mixture of different GCs who are up there, and they're speaking either with their colleagues or with their peers or with their team or people from other teams. And I think that's really, really important. And I touched on it earlier, but them sharing what's not just worked well, but what they've tried and hasn't worked. And that's given people that permission. And it's really brought the fail fast, because it can be a bit of a cliche that when if people say, oh, we're going to do it, we're going to fail fast. But actually, the most important part is what we learn from that. So whether we succeed or fail, we're going to learn, and we have learned. And that's been a really, really great thing to be able to experience. And I have experienced it in the past and on other programs, but this has been a really particularly great engagement.
Yeah, and I think that kind of that also that focus on the failures as well, and that open communication from everyone within the leadership role, because I think sometimes when you're looking at implementing something new, you're looking at rollouts, you want, your main goal is to show senior leadership that it was worth it. And then you're kind of afraid of communicating those failures and those blockers and the things that are going wrong. But if if you have that constant communication and that idea that yes, let's share our failures, let's share our blockers, what went wrong, and learn from that. And I also think that even small things like leadership making time for learning and it's part of their day to day and normalizing experimentation, it kind of signals that this is not something extra we expect you to do on the side. It's going to become part of how we deliver the service going forward.
Correct. Yeah. And actually, to your point, you just made me remember something. So when we were going through the sprints and that, people were saying we want more, we'd like more training on prompting. And lots of people always say they want more training on prompting. But my chief legal officer said, like, I want to be on the first session. So we worked out how best to deliver it, what partner we were going to deliver that with. But he was at the first session with a number of colleagues, and it wasn't just all the senior people. We had a real mixture in the room, but he was one of the test sessions, and then we got feedback, and they had a debriefing session. We then did, we ran a few tests because, as I say, we've got quite a big team, and we either did in person or virtual. We didn't try and do them combined, but we ran those sessions. So yeah, it was for people to know that that's what he wanted, and he wanted to make sure that people knew, because lots of people would sometimes say, I can't make the time to attend this session. But when you can say, well, Bob did because it's that important, that really helped. And the rest of we had other people from his leadership team engaged in those early sessions. So it was, as I say, it ended up being a great example.
Yeah, no, I think that is, yeah, it is important, and it's going to become second nature. I know it doesn't seem like that right now, because it's not brand new, but I think we feel like it's this whole new beast to tackle. But
every time we work out what we've got today, there's then the next thing comes out, and the next thing comes out, and the next thing comes out. So it is building blocks, but I think having the foundations, I think if people are still earlier in their journey, do not underestimate the value of investing in the foundations, because that will save time later on down the road. And that will allow the people who maybe haven't felt confident to really engage and haven't felt like they've got the space that they can engage. And I don't mean catch up, but it is a bit of feeling like sometimes people feel like everybody else knows what they're talking about. And I often say, if anybody says, I know what is going to happen in generative AI in 18 months or even 12 months, I'm saying, well, I have no idea. But, you can see things building and changing. So yeah, it's about really building that inclusive space and welcoming people in.
So I think this kind of leads to my next question, and I know this is probably one of those questions that you can answer with it depends on where you are, but let's say you're advising a GC who's starting out today, hasn't started with the foundations. What would you recommend, like, the first 90 days to look like?
So, and I think there's a few different things in there. So again, looking at your people, what are the skills, whether you can capture a baseline of where they're at. But that might be something you can do a bit later, and it sounds ridiculous, but not your first 90 days. But if you want to capture a baseline, the other thing is, work out what tools that you already have in your organization that you could make available to the legal team, and come up with some use cases and run some sessions that allow people to do hands-on experimenting and trialing. So don't try and squish a session in with loads and loads of content. Do less content and allow hands-on. And that's where you'll start to, get people who might be nervous or worried. Dummy data set. That is one thing. Come up with the ideas for some use cases, and you will be easily able to find stuff. So even if you're an organization that has Copilot, there is a lot of stuff that is available, through Microsoft. There's lots of legal use cases because their own legal team does use it. But the same applies to Google. So it doesn't really matter what the tool is, but you can start this with a generic AI tool, and get those examples there, and then have a place that's central, like a bit of a hub that people can easily get to, and they can find the information and they can, help themselves. So that's one place I would start. You've then got your process. I potentially, if given a chance again, or if I was starting somewhere else, I would try and find a revenue generating process that legal gets involved in. And the reason I would do that, it's not always a place that we start. And a lot of organizations might start in the procurement space. And I suppose there is less risk there. So I'm not saying don't start there. But if there is a revenue generating process, maybe it's a sales cycle, maybe a deal cycle, whatever that is, and legal is involved, that's a really great place to start, because when it comes to budget, it then isn't necessarily just a legal, having to try and find the budget within the legal sphere. Now, some organizations recharge for legal, so that, there's different ways of doing it. So it does, again, depend on your organization. But I do think it then becomes an organization conversation about what tools are the right tools to help legal end up speeding up that cycle. As I say, for some people that will be difficult, and you will always need to start with lower risk, lower complexity, which ends up being more cost, cutting driven, or efficiency drives. But that would be, if you could, that would be where I would look.
So yeah, thank you so much, Jodi. I think that's been incredibly insightful. And I think what stands out is that kind of the successful AI adoption isn't necessarily about the technology tool that you use at the end of the day. It's more about the behavior, the leadership, how the teams work day to day. Because as you pointed out, we don't know what the AI landscape is going to look like in 18 months and what tools are going to be available. But when you have those foundations in place, it makes that adoption and scalability down the line a lot easier to implement and to adapt to, rather than focusing on a technology tool itself that then ends up changing and kind of rocks the boat,
in
a sense.
And I think actually another thing I missed was, it's having a North Star. So combining AI with human expertise to simplify and accelerate, for our stakeholders, and our customers and our partners, that if we can get this right, it benefits, our suppliers as well as our customers and our stakeholders. And I think we haven't talked much about the process. I know I've mentioned the three, but the process is, simplify first. So don't optimize or speed up a process that's potentially not great and is broken. So don't underestimate that. And it is something that we focus, a lot more, I'd say a few years ago. It feels like it's coming back again. It's definitely something for us, not just in legal, but right across the firm.
Yeah, and that really resonates, that simplifying the process first. I think when we had a chat last week on this, it's when you think a process is simple and you ask 5 people to describe how to make a cup of coffee, you're going to have 7 different answers. And I think that is something, it's a simple process, everyone does it. But when you try to kind of describe and take it down to steps, it might come out different in different ways.
Exactly.
So kind of looking at the basics, looking at how to simplify a process. Thank you so much, Jodi. I want to move on to the Q&A part of the session. We have a question. Have you found any pockets of resistance to change? And if so, how did you deal with it?
So we did find, there were, along the way, there was definitely steps. And I think we had so many people that did want to do and engage that we were able to lead with those people first. We did have examples, I'd say, where, quite often there's panel firms, you've got various software suppliers, you've got conferences, so people were going out and might sort of have an interest or a preference to one tool versus another. So sometimes, wanting to work out what else is there. I think one of the best things we did was to, we actually simplified that process. So instead of looking at so many different things, it's, what are the like three big things that will help our legal teams. And that was really good. So if you can work out what, three big rocks or two big rocks and pick a priority and take that forward, that was good. So as far as the resistance, it's some of it's time, and sometimes it's engaging with them and understanding what that resistance is. Again, depending on the size of the team, but it's, I've often found sitting down and talking to people or listen. It's not actually me talking to them; it's me listening to them, and understanding, what are their pain points. And there are a number of things. Again, we've focused on what people have said is difficult. People spend a lot of time in meetings and they don't want to spend as much time in meetings, or, going through documents and they're wanting to, it's taking them a long time to do the backwards and forwards of negotiating. So how can we improve review? How can we improve that review process? So yeah, I'm not sure I've done a great job of answering that question, but sometimes it's just, again, listen to what they're saying and then find the people who are really up for it, let them go first. And really the biggest thing has been our lawyers, paralegals, legal ops people doing the work, talking about the work they've done and how the AI tools have helped them do the work has been the biggest unlock.
Yeah, sharing those success cases and actual implementation rather than just a theoretical possibility of something making a difference.
Yeah.
Another question is, what is the use case that has produced the most noticeable results to date?
I think from our general productivity tool, I'd say things around, we're probably a bit early on our more complex workflow activities. So we're probably still too early. We're in pilot at the minute. And things going live and using them at scale. I think I'm just trying to think of where would be a good one. I think looking at legal design, that's been something that we did a while back. Tone of voice. What's our corporate tone of voice? We're forever wanting to make documents and legal documents easier for the public to engage with. And I feel that that's where generative AI, if you can get that persona and the prompts in the right place, and you think of, and again, you potentially want some communications people involved within that project as well as, but I've found the lawyers have done some great things with the LLMs and think about, English may not be someone's first language. And, how do you make sure that we write it in I think is it called, I'm going to get it wrong now, Flesh Kincaid? There's a grading for the English language, a grade level. But, sometimes for me, I've even done things where, there's a formal rating of it, but I've said like GCSE English or, there's things you can do within those. So that's been, I'd say, a good place. If you haven't started, look at your policies, terms and conditions, those sorts of things that may go out to, that customers may be reading and how to make them more accessible. I think that's a great use case for generative AI.
And then just, I'm aware of the time and we've had such a great conversation, but one last question. If you were starting out again, would you do something differently in the first 6 to 12 months with the benefit you have now of hindsight?
I mean, other than trying to get access to the tools earlier to be able to get something in the hands of the lawyers, and I don't know whether that's something that, with hindsight, we could do that again. But I do think within your organization, if you're having resistance, use the fact of what legal professionals, that responsibility that they've got, that discipline, and that, they are quite careful anyway. So giving them access to the tools and giving them the training and giving them the space to work with it, of all the teams in the organization, they're one of the best ones to do it with. And in my experience, they really did grasp it and, and really did, our adoption was fantastic. So we were, they were using the tool a lot. And and I already touched on the bit that, again, it depends on the organization. And I don't know if, I'm not saying I could have done this, but again, picking that, and it's talking to other people in other organizations, picking somewhere that's a revenue generating, having that use case
Yeah.
and not just starting with, I mean, NDAs always comes up. And in some organizations, NDAs are really complex. In others, they're pretty straightforward. So again, it's finding that balance of balancing a low risk, but don't just do all the easy or the low hanging fruit. Try and get a balance right, which I think we did. I think we have done. But that would be it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for great questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, so we'll send out follow-up comms for those questions that we can answer, and really appreciate it. And Jodi, just one final close, and I think you did touch on this slightly with the question around advising a GC starting today, but kind of what's the one action you would encourage people to take next after this call?
Speak to your leadership, get time with your GC and their leads, and work through what the North Star is. You probably do know the strategy, but go back to what's the strategy and the vision of legal. Why is legal there? And then it's working out, how do you tie things that you're doing? And that doesn't matter whether it's AI or not. That applies to anything that you're trying to do with the change and adoption, and make sure people understand what's in it for them. Because if you can help articulate that, then people will be able to relate to it. They'll be able to talk about it. They'll be able to talk about it in their team meetings. So yeah, definitely, whether it's you or your manager or somebody, but get that time with the leadership team and be clear on that North Star.
Thank you so much again, Jodi, for all of your time and answering the questions and having this discussion with us today. And thank you everyone else for joining as well and for your questions that you've posed.
Great. Thank you very much.